G'day trendsetters, welcome to episode 3 of the Wabi podcast. Today I'd like to explore the idea of collaboration. More specifically, I think that teists or tea ceremony artists or Japanese tea ceremony practitioners collaborate with more artists more often than any other type of artist. What do you reckon? Polish the floor, grab a tea and tune in. The idea of collaboration has been a burning question for me for many years. Ever since living in Japan and doing tea ceremony with other people and crossing boundaries of artistic disciplines, I'd been unconvinced of the idea of korabo. It's a Japanese katakana way of saying collaboration. When I was doing so-called collaborations in Japan, I would also look outwards and on the internet and look at other collaborations in my research for preparing for such collaborations and see that often a collaboration, or what was considered a collaboration, was just two artists doing the same thing that they've always done side by side. And for me that was lacking something. I think that in a collaboration there's a new exploration to be had where both or more parties will grow through this encounter of creating a new artistic expression or object. And so there has to be some sort of bending or breaking of one's usual practice in order to accommodate the other artist, and forge something new together that requires growth from all involved. And inherent in the idea that I proposed at the start of the podcast, namely that a tea ceremony practitioner or a teist has more collaborations with more artists more often, is a sort of destabilization of the idea that a so-called tea master is an elite that has a unique perspective of beauty and basically decides the beautiful and constructs a tea gathering with an orchestration of things that he or she or they consider beautiful. So more concretely, when you think about the aspects of a tea ceremony, you have a tea bowl, you have a mizusashi, a freshwater container, you have a brazier, you have a furusaki byobu, a petition at the far side of the tea space. You have a tea house that you practice the tea gathering inside of. You have calligraphy, or you have an ink painting that you're hanging in the alcove. You have bamboo ware, whether it be a vase or a tea scoop. Now these are all created by other individual artists. Now some of them might consider themselves an artisan rather than an artist. They're basically just producing, and it's up to the tea person to decide the concept and the angle of beauty that they want to go for when incorporating these wares into a tea gathering. But more and more, and especially as tea starts to incorporate contemporary art in other parts of the world, not just Japan, the individuality of the artist is inherent in the pieces that the tea practitioner uses in their compositions of a unique tea gathering. So the elite pedestal that the tea master once inhabited is taken away, and the tea person is brought onto a level playing field, so to speak, or an even field with the other artists. And something that can illustrate this, if you think to the popular movie Ask This of Rikyū, there's a famous scene where, of course, we don't know whether Rikyū ever said this in his life or whether he thought this way in his lifetime or not. But in the movie, they have Rikyū answering the question of what is beauty. And he says, "Bi wa watashi ga kimeru koto desu." Beauty is what I say it is. And this idea endures in the tea world. I would say that the majority of people that have achieved a fair degree of proficiency in the tea ceremony would consider, whether they say it or not, that they have a more acute vision of what is the beautiful than other people. To take away that elitism, which detracts from the beauty of what we do, I'd like to explore the sense of collaboration with equal others. So To destabilise this ill-conceived view that tea masters have an elite perspective of what is beautiful and can therefore decide the beautiful for other people, I'd like to offer the idea that art is an agreement. So it's not what so-and-so tea master decrees or ordains is beautiful, it's an agreement between different parties. Something that can highlight how this works is we think of Marcel Duchamp's work. Now, he focused on that decision of what is a piece of art, and he started to employ ready-mades like a bottle rack or a urinal or a bicycle wheel or a snow shovel, and said, this is an artwork. And it was such a radical idea that a lot of people jumped on board, as controversial as it was, and agreed with him. Now, I don't know if you can do the same thing today. The idea's done. We've been presented this idea in a unique radical context in the Armoury exhibition in 1920, whatever it was, and the thrill has gone. So now if you started to present a urinal or something of like nature as an artwork, people would say, oh God, this has been done. Like, no. But we have that historical moment that can be included in our dialogue, in a collaboration of conceiving what is art or what is the beautiful. And when I mention collaboration, I don't mean collaboration with other people, I also mean collaboration with the history of your tradition or your art practice. Now, Rick Rubin is on board with me in this. I'll quote him here from his latest book. He said, art is an agreement. You're never alone when you're making art. You're in constant dialogue with what is and what was. And the closer you can tune in to that discussion, the better you'll serve the work before you. So let me offer some examples of the collaborations that I've had the privilege to participate in through the course of my career that hopefully can offer some things for our brains to latch onto as I pick apart the meaning and the significance of true collaboration. The first example that comes to mind when I think of Rick Rubin's quote is a collaboration between Tomokazu Matsuyama and myself. It happened, I think, 2015 in New York. Matsu is a painter. He has his studio in Brooklyn, and in 2015 I went to do a chanoyu, or a tea ceremony, incorporating his artworks to a private showing of his art and tea ceremony and other performative aspects that we put together. And the dialogue that we were involved in, i.e. what is and what was the history of our traditions. I'm coming from a traditional Japanese tea ceremony background, and I'm trying to bring the contemporary into the tradition. And Matsu is a contemporary painter who has a deep respect for the Japanese traditional arts. So in his contemporary work, he's trying to reference tradition and bring tradition into his contemporary practice. This reverse directionality that we have in our respective practices is one place that we found common ground. And the theme of this collaboration was the outsider looking in, or from outside looking in. What that refers to is that for both of us, we're kind of an outsider looking in to a foreign tradition. So for me, I'm an Australian and I'm practicing a traditional Japanese art. And for Matsu, he's Japanese, practicing contemporary Western painting. And that gives a unique perspective, because when you come from outside a tradition, you can sort of see it in an objective manner that can be quite advantageous at the same time where there's disadvantages of being rejected by that tradition. But anyway, that's another podcast. And so after establishing this common ground, we could then riff on each other's ideas and respective artworks, as in the flow of the tea ceremony that I could present and the ways that I can incorporate his artworks and the ideas embodied therein, and try and find ways that we can evoke each other's worlds in a new presentation of our respective arts in a unified whole that was captivating and interesting for the people that were going to participate. An example of this was the title of his artwork, that was going to be the kakijiku, or the centerpiece for the tea ceremony, was whatever the Playboy wrote, it was as good as the great waves. Now, Playboy was referencing a nickname for Picasso because in his painting he had referenced a Picasso painting. And he also referenced some classical Japanese paintings, i.e. from Tsukiyoka Yoshitoshi, and some of his paintings of the aspects of the moon. And so, because there was so many lofty philosophical concepts floating around in our respective worlds, to make it immediately approachable for our guests, we tried to introduce some humour. Some of the ways that we added humour into the collaboration was to get some old Playboy magazines on which to present the bowls of tea, i.e. referencing the name of the poem in a literal sense by actually using a Playboy magazine. And when we serve tea, we put it on a piece of fabric and present it to the guests for high quality tea, the koicha. And instead of using a shikibuksa or a serving cloth, I used an open Playboy magazine as the serving cloth. So quite a radical, contemporary mode of presenting tradition. And then just this last weekend, I've been involved in a huge fury of different collaborations in southern Germany. I was invited by Simon Manoha, a contemporary ceramicist, a French ceramicist, to do chanoyu at his exhibition. And the concept for his exhibition that he wrote referenced the way that we could also find common ground and bend each other's practice to try and incorporate the other's perspective. So I'll quote what he wrote here. He said, "Vacuity is alterity, or otherness. In void, there is emerging with otherness. In Adam's work and mine, there is a shared path from emptiness to welcoming others. The tea master releases controlling thoughts to make tea for their guest. The artist empties their consciousness to clear the way for pure creation." So the sense of void inherent in both of our practices, he has a deep respect for tea ceramics. He makes a lot of tea bowls and mizusashi and sake wares and chaire that we use in the tea ceremony as a parenthesis to his greater body of sculptural works. Anybody that studied Levinas would have identified the term alterity, which is a direct reference to the philosopher Levinas, Emmanuel Levinas. And through Levinas's philosophy and Zen philosophy, we were able to find some sort of commonality that we discussed in WhatsApp messages in a fury before we decided what we were going to do. And that allowed us to converge and find a centre point for our collaboration. And then another collaboration I was lucky to have was with a team of 3 artists that live in southern Germany, namely Ariane, Mateusz Budasz, and Martin Schwer. This team of 3 makes some incredibly thrilling, deconstructed dwellings that people can inhabit and feel the materiality of the architecture and the way that space is created through these skeleton constructions. So when I saw these, I was immediately interested and curious of collaborating and building a tea house together in which to do chanoyu at a ceramics market on the Sunday. And I proposed a collaboration to them and gave them some ideas of what a chashitsu was about to see if there was going to be some sort of common ground by sharing these concepts and pictures towards building something together. And they came back with the idea of a Gehhaus, which in one of the dialects in Germany, I guess southern Germany, the Black Forest area, means not only an architectural case or enclosure or house, it philosophically means a home or a room that necessarily includes people and offers shelter and a vicinity for these people to inhabit. So they found that the concept of chashitsu, or a tea house, and Gehhaus overlapped quite well, and they were super enthusiastic about this project, and I think we achieved something quite nice. But coming back to the collaboration with Simon and I, and the philosophy of Levinas, we created kind of a Stonehenge ambient sort of park in the gallery, and we did tea inside this Stonehenge of his head sculptures, or mountain/head sculptures, that really conjured up a very deeply moving ambience in which to do tea. And in a poem of one of the koans in The Gateless Gate, or the Mumonkan, there's a line, "The spring that transcends yin and yang." And in this space, I kind of felt some of that spring, that vibrant atmosphere in which people can collaborate and come together in a relatively equal fashion in which to forge something new and not just practice side by side, so to speak. Do what they've always done, but do it side by side. And I think that this came through a collaboration that recognises the subjectivity and the inherent humanity of the other person. And Levinas would say that genuine understanding and ethical collaboration begins from a recognition of the radical otherness of the other person. So what does he mean by that? He means in this otherness that you are never ever going to be able to access the perspective of the other person. It might seem like a no-brainer, but this clashed with my Zen practice, i.e. attaining a sense of oneness, where perspectives melt away and there's just pure consciousness. But it made me think with Levinas's philosophy, where he speaks about the impossibility of achieving a view from the other person. When you awaken to deeper truth, it's still a deeper truth from the perspective of here. It's a view from nowhere, but a view from nowhere from this point. And a view from nowhere from another person is still at another point in time and space. And I related this to some of the famous Zen koans that talk about this heart-to-heart communication. The example that first comes to mind is the very origin point of Zen Buddhism, which is the flower sermon, where the Buddha got before the audience one day and held up a single lotus flower and remained sitting in silence. And his audience were dumbfounded as to what he wanted to communicate. But just one person, Mahakashapa, gave a little smile as a sign of his understanding, shared understanding of what the Buddha wanted to transmit. So it's this heart-to-heart communication. Though they were united in consciousness, the points in which they were united were still separate in time and space. This highlights the dual aspect of Zen practice, whereas we can go very, very abstract, but at the same time we have to remain very, very particular in all things and how to harmonise the concrete particular with the lofty idea. And this interplay of dual perspectives comes out in Levinas's philosophy, where he says that collaboration emerges from individuals responding to the call of the other. And that call, of course, is to engage in dialogue, and in our case, engage in an artistic collaboration. And when we engage with other people by respecting their individuality, their subjectiveness, and their inherent humanity, this expands our own worldview and our own body of knowledge and our own awareness of what is possible in artistic creation and human living. If we take this up to the level of societies, like at the moment, the Japanese tea ceremony world is being stretched by its encounter with other cultures. So, like me, what I'm doing, I'm practicing tea outside of Japan in different places around the world and bringing those cultures into contact with the culture of the Japanese tea ceremony, and thereby widening and expanding the ken of the Japanese tea ceremony to include other ideas that harmonise with this traditional form. And therefore, the identity of the Japanese tea ceremony is being expanded in the process. It doesn't just include kimono, wabi-sabi objects in a rustic tea house anymore. It can also include functional yet sculptural ceramics made by a French person from harvested minerals and clay, brought to life in a contemporary architectural tea house or gehouse made by 3 people from southern Germany, and animated by an Australian. The form and the philosophy underneath is staying the same, but it's being expanded. The identity of this form is being expanded by this deep awareness and contact with other people and other cultures. And while some traditionalists might scream shock horror at the thought that we are fouling this noble tradition, I actually think that this is a great example of justice in Levinas's sense, which is respecting the alterity or the otherness of the other person or other tradition, foreign tradition, while comprehending that complete assimilation into one's own identity is impossible. So we're sincerely trying to forge a new understanding with the consciousness that in the end, a complete understanding is unachievable, and making the best of the situation with the celebration of incompleteness, or that void that is never going to be bridged. A collaboration which I deeply admire and I think illustrates the void that is still left in a really sincere effort to bridge the void, or bridge the gaps in understanding of respective traditions and backgrounds, is the musical outfit Chiri, Chiri, which is a group put together by Simon Barker, who's a jazz drummer from Sydney, who made a very considered and thorough attempt to try and discover the shamanistic drumming traditions from Korea. And in his search, you can actually watch this in a documentary titled Intangible Asset 82, Intangible Cultural Asset number 82. He discovers different shamans on the way to trying to discover the person who played some incredible drum music. And one of the singers that he encountered in his search and helped him to find the musicians that he was seeking was Bae Il-dong. And he's a remarkable voice artist who communes with nature and waterfalls and the rocks and the mountains and the air through his voice, extremely powerful voice. And Simon Barker invited him to collaborate, and Chiri, Chiri, or Chiri, is the result. So you can check out that on Bandcamp. I'll put the links in the description. This example illustrates people coming together from a very deep background of a very particular and sophisticated cultural form and trying to forge something from a sincere attempt at understanding the different viewpoints, honouring the perspective that they'll never embody for themselves, but letting the vibrancy of the void of incomplete understanding bring something altogether new to life. And you'll be able to hear that with your ears. And it's also an extremely good example because it's a radically different culture, i.e. jazz culture, and Korean shaman singing, just like combining the Japanese tea ceremony and contemporary Western art. And with my discontent about the korabo aspect of collaboration, i.e. practicing side by side, not actually making a considered attempt to understand the other to create something new, in this documentary you see ways in which they really get inside each other's sphere of understanding by bending and cracking it open through humour. When I was driving over to Germany with Simon in the car, one moment that cracked the air open and allowed us to come together in a shared understanding through concepts and art and love of music was after lunch. We hopped back in the car and he ripped out the CD that was in the CD player and put in another CD which was the best of Marvin Gaye. And he cranked up the volume to the loudest it had been thus far in our trip and started screaming with an animated body like this as we're getting back on the highway and fanging it for 130 k's. And he looked at me and said, "There's nothing like a little Marvin Gaye after a siesta." And I got to know him and knew that our shared passion for music and dance and movement and the vibration of really deep, pure, soulful human emotion would knit together over the weekend to bring out the best of our respective traditions and practices to manifest a new collaboration. And then when you get down into the nuts and bolts of it, say you're setting up, I'll give the example of our chanoyu installation. It's never ever 50-50. If you're always trying to achieve an even standing in each decision, the collaboration is not going to come alive. Sometimes you'll be 80%, the other person's ideas will be 20%. Sometimes your ideas will be 10% and the others will be 90% of the decisions that are made along the way. So, for instance, I had designed a space that was based on geometry, and through the trials and tribulations of setting up and working with other people to create the plinths and platforms that we were using, some of the materials weren't available at the end of the day in which to realise this vision that I had created. And so that vision representing, say, 80%, because Simon's works were included, but it was basically my ideas running the geometry, suddenly became the other way around. We had to think of a way that we can use the pieces to become the predominant force in the T space, and relied more on the pieces rather than the geometrical placement of the pieces that I had thought of. And there's this constant give and take, and one person stepping up to put the ideas forward, and one person stepping back to take on this proposal, and vice versa, towards something new. In these decisions, there's always an oscillation of different frequencies all the time towards the realisation of a collaboration. And so to stretch my sphere, so with a new space, it was in a diamond shape rather than an elongated diamond shape with two squares. And one square where the tea inhabited and one square where the guests inhabited. And with this new diamond shape, without the intricacies of the mid part, I had to stretch the way that I did the tea ceremony to accommodate these new dimensions. And so that stretched the understanding of my art open into ways that I can accommodate guests in a new formation. And with the resonance of the artworks that surrounded us in like a Stonehenge sculpture, and other people sitting on chairs in between each of the heads, with the sculptural head that represented also a mountain, and the human head in between, one after the other, I think the guests that were situated there really had a very deep relationship with the tea and also the sculptural works, creating a resonance with each other that evolved into a new work. So for tea people, I think it's imperative to honour the call of the other that's embodied in each of our pieces that we use in a tea gathering, and make a sincere attempt to understand the humanity and the tradition and the artistic practice behind each of the pieces that we weave together in our presentation of a tea gathering, and to expand the knowledge of ourselves through our practice. And so our guests also have the opportunity to honour and respect the call of the other, and therefore deepen their understanding of themselves through the otherness of the things that they encounter in tea gatherings. So the subject or the theme that the poetry or calligraphy offers, and the minerals and earth and techniques that were used in firing the chawan that they drink from, or the long historical tradition of cultivating tea in Asia that distills in Japan and offers that refined matcha that we can share as a unified body of individuals in the tea room, engaging in an artistic practice that advances and deepens our understanding of self and others. So thanks for listening to these thoughts on collaboration. I'll put all the artists that I mentioned in the description. To join the mailing list for this podcast, you can sign up to my Patreon for free or for paid. Or if you'd like some tea or my translated book, you can go to my online store. If you'd like to go deeper into the world of chanoyu and learn this thing, send me a message via my website. Thanks for listening, and go and funk Wabi.